Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, January the 13th, 2026. Some of our older listeners, like myself, might be familiar with, originally it was a stage musical called The Music Man. It came on Broadway, I think, in 1957, then got made into a movie, 1962, popular movie. The Music Man was about small town in Iowa that experienced a terrible fate. A man called Harold Hill came along and ripped off everyone there. The city was called, or the little town was called River City, and it was based on a real place called Mason City in Iowa. My guest today is from Mason City, and he has a new book out. It's called On Fire for God. Josiah Hesse is a very interesting character, and in a way, his own experience, his own autobiography is a narrative of the Music Man, and I'd be curious to know who is Harold Hill in this narrative. Josiah is joining us from Denver, where we live. Josiah, you're too young to at least have grown up with the Music Man, aren't you?
Well, when you grow up in Mason City, Iowa, you're never too young to grow up with the Music Man. It's everywhere you turn. You go to the local Hardee's, and it's a museum for the Music Man.
So what's your narrative before we get to your own particular narrative, what's your narrative on the Music Man itself, and how does it connect with Mason City?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. The guy who wrote The Music Man, Meredith Willson, was from Mason City, and he wrote it about his hometown. And it's a story of a traveling con man who goes from small town to small town, finding whatever is new in the area in technology, culture, and turning it into a source of fear for the people, and then quickly offers the solution, which is to invest in a boys' marching band. And he sells them the instruments and the instruction books and the uniforms, but he has no idea how to make any music. He's never had any kind of training in music, let alone marching bands. And he always skips town before anyone finds out. And growing up with this, I just loved it as a musical on the face of it. It's great songs, it's great story, great performances. But when I started reporting on evangelicals and taking a hard look at my background as a hardcore evangelical zealot, I started seeing all these parallels between characters from the last century and beyond and the story of Harold Hill. It's something that's been playing out in America, particularly with working class Christians for generations.
Yeah, it's a very American story, isn't it? I mean, we often talk about Gatsby on this show. I'm not sure if Gatsby would have been comfortable with Mason City. In fact, that's the sort of small town America he originally was from before he went out to the East Coast. One thinks perhaps also of Donald Trump. He didn't grow up in a place like Mason City, but perhaps he has something in common with Harold Hill, the protagonist of the Music Man. Is that fair, Josiah? Is there something peculiarly American about small towns like Mason City, real small towns like Mason City, and fictional ones like River City?
Well, in that case, River City is Mason City. Meredith Willson only changed the name because he thought everyone in Mason City would hate him for it. And I've always been surprised at the way the city has championed this story, because it is a satire about the gullibility of small town people and how they can be manipulated by a fast talking con man. So Mason City really is River City. And I think there's certainly a lot of parallels to be drawn between Donald Trump and Harold Hill. Both of them purport to be geniuses of their field. You know, with Trump, it's business or government, and with Hill, it was a boys' marching band. But both of them are completely inept in those arenas. But where I would say they both are geniuses is in marketing. They're both genius storytellers. They know how to prey on people's fears, how to locate the thing that's changing, that's new, and offer something that harkens back to another era, a pure era of American wholesomeness, the Make America Great Again, if you will. And that's something that's been playing out again and again, going back more than a century. But my book just looks from 1925 to 2025.
I checked the latest thing that powerful people are selling to Americans, AI, and checked in about Mason City, asked Google's Gemini whether Mason City is a nice place to live. And I actually said that it is. I'm not sure if it is. What was your experience, Josiah, of Mason City? What kind of place was it to grow up in?
Well, there are things that I love about Mason City, and there's an additional town that's like right next door, Clear Lake. Clear Lake was kind of a small touristy town. Both were the big cities for the area. Clear Lake having about 7,000 people, and Mason City, I don't know, maybe 15 to 20. Someone can fact check me on that. But there was a lot to love about it. It's both
27,000, at least according to Wikipedia.
There you go.
The 2020 census. So Wikipedia is usually relatively accurate.
Yeah, and to find a bigger city, you'd have to go to Minneapolis up north or Des Moines down south. But in my particular experience, I grew up going to a lot of evangelical churches and camps and conventions and Christian rock shows, and was very much immersed in the Christian right. I was a young Republican. I was a promise keeper. It was really my whole world. I was going to church events on average around 9 times a week. There was literally nothing a part of my youth that wasn't immersed in the Christian right. I didn't go to any sports or marching band. Certainly, there were a lot of opportunities for that. But I grew up with a lot of shame and terror and poverty, and was surrounded by a lot of mental illness and addiction, and verbal abuse, and a lot of manipulation from these evangelical institutions that had this thing called prosperity gospel, which is quite similar to the think system in The Music Man. Harold Hill has this whole thing where he tells the kids, like, don't touch your instruments, don't try and play them, just imagine yourself playing them and you will magically develop these abilities. And in prosperity gospel, what we heard from a lot of the preachers was, if you invest in God, is the way they'd phrase it, which is really the church, invest over the 10% that you're already giving of your income each week, you'll have a tenfold return. And the more outrageous a risk you're taking with the amount of money you're giving to the church, the greater your reward will be. It's kind of the equivalent of snake handling, but with your finances. The more dangerous it is.
Sounds like crypto. It sounds like the arguments that many quote unquote investors make in Silicon Valley, encouraging people to put their money into crypto. And the capitalist piece is, of course, essential to the American narrative. So coming back to The Music Man and Harold Hill, he was a pure con man. Who are the con men or women, Josiah, in your upbringing? Because we've done lots of shows on the evangelicals. Most of my guests aren't particularly keen on them. They see them as intellectually fraudulent, at least, or selling a vision which isn't entirely true. And I'm not sure anyone's quite presented the evangelical church as an extended version of Harold Hill. Are you suggesting in your book and in the experience that these are just pure con people who are ripping off the innocent locals of many of small town American of small town America like Mason City?
I would argue that the results are the same. In terms of what's in people's minds and hearts when they're propagating this prosperity gospel, people like Paula White, Joel Osteen, in my generation, Oral Roberts, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. I'm not going to be so presumptuous as to say that they know they're ripping people off and they don't believe it and they're just laughing their way to the bank and thinking what gullible rubes all of these people are. But there was a great line by the author Upton Sinclair and I'm paraphrasing here. He said something to the effect of, "It's very difficult to convince a man of something when his paycheck depends on him not understanding it." And so with a lot of these preachers, they go to these institutions. A lot of the people that I was raised with, the pastors that I was raised with, were taught by Oral Roberts University or Rhema University, where they learned a lot of this rhetoric. And perhaps they really believed that it was working out. And if there was any evidence of that, it was on their end. They would often brag about the material wealth that they had, the cars, the vacations, the homes, as evidence of the efficacy of prosperity gospel. Look at me, look at how much God has blessed me. And after so many years of that, I started looking around at the sanctuary and thinking, all these people are still shopping at thrift stores. They're all still on food stamps. They're all, earning minimum wage or at least not climbing out of poverty. So this doesn't really seem to be working out for the congregation, even though it's working out quite well for the pastors.
Is it a critique implicitly or explicitly, Josiah, of Christianity itself or just a certain branch? Because, of course, Mason City, Iowa is not that far from Salt Lake City, Utah, the home of the Mormons, who have made a great success, if not out of that evangelicalism, certainly in terms of their mentality, their work ethic, and their success in the world. So is it just certain strains, in your view, of evangelical Christianity that bring out the fear and the shame and the exaggerated poverty of a white working class in America?
I would agree with that. I wouldn't agree that Mormons are successful and happy.
I'm not suggesting that, but all I'm saying is, and I think the stats bear me out, I'm not usually a stats guy, is that Mormon Americans are wealthier than the average American. They've been more quote unquote successful, if that's how you quantify success. So they're as a demographic, they're better off than the average American.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of poverty in fundamentalist Mormon circles. John Krakauer wrote a great book about that, Under the Banner of Heaven, that was made into an excellent miniseries. But to get back to your point about evangelical Christians, which are similar to Mormons, but theologically pretty far afield, I do think that Christianity is large enough to contain all kinds of beliefs and practices. And we've seen that throughout American history with all the social upheaval that we've seen in our lifetime, the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, the civil rights movement of the 60s. You have Christians on both sides of those issues using the Bible and using the tenets of their version of Christianity to argue the case for and against slavery or women having the right to vote or being empowered. So I view the Bible as almost a Rorschach test that you see in it what you want to see in it. And this book is, thousands of years old, has been written by thousands of different men. It's gone through so many different translations. There's so many different versions of it. It's really so broad and complex. It makes the U.S. Constitution look like a Hemingway sentence. So really, any belief that you have, you can find a biblical passage to justify it. If you want to beat your kids, if you want to, put your wife to death, if you want to own slaves, there's scriptures for that. But if you want to, liberate women, or be a liberated woman, if you want to be a sexual.
Popped out. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that was just when when it was getting interesting. We were starting to talk about sex, Josiah. I think that the evangelicals were controlling the
Yeah,
audio
it was just
on
too much for my headset. So yeah, you can find anything in the Bible to justify literally any belief.
I take your point on that. Tell me a little bit about your own background, your parents, your family, your upbringing, and how this evangelical version of the world was presented to you. Was it presented as a kind of punishment, as a gift? What would have happened is as a, I don't know, 9, 10, 11-year-old, you just simply said to your family, I don't believe any of this stuff. Leave me alone. I don't want to deal with it.
I certainly never would have done that. I became a more hardcore believer than anyone around me. I was seriously invested in finding my ticket out of hell, out of eternal torment. And if you believe in eternal torture, and you believe that there are all kinds of pathways to that, it's going to be your top priority, especially as a young person who doesn't understand what sin is, what the boundaries of sin is. So I was very obsessed with the Bible and Christianity. I mean, I learned about this at the same time I was learning that water is wet, the sky is blue, gravity makes things fall to the ground. So this was just my everyday reality. There wasn't anything I learned about that wasn't somehow infused in this. And whether or not it was, as you say, like a source of love or punishment, I would say both. We talked about God's love a great deal, but I didn't really understand it in practice. And to be honest, still don't really understand it on an intellectual or visceral level. Whereas hell is quite tangible. And we put on a lot of plays, hell houses, passion plays that were very violent and very terrifying. And so I would say that fear and shame were at the forefront of the rhetoric that I absorbed as a young person.
When we're looking for blame, I mean, obviously we can find the Harold Hills from the Music Man in other evangelical movements, and you've already touched on that a little bit. But shouldn't ultimately the blame for an 8 or a 9 or 10-year-old being exposed to this isn't to the evangelical Harold Hill, it's to your family, to your parents, to the people who sucked you into this nonsense?
Well, they didn't believe it was nonsense. And so in their minds, it was as reasonable as telling me to look both ways when crossing the street or not to touch the stove when it's hot. So they were doing what they believed was right to keep me safe as a young person because they believed in hell, just like I did. So I don't really have blame for any of the people in my community. I mean, maybe my a few pastors who, you know, put some pretty harsh rhetoric in our heads at young ages. But again, they believed it as well. I can't say for certain who was the cynic who, just thought we were all rubes and were laughing to the bank. As I write many times in the book, I have compassion for every character in this story. I'm not a huge fan of Antonin Scalia, but I do quote him in the author's note when he said that he attacks ideas and not people. And that's really what I set out to do in this book, is attack the ideas of the Christian right and not any of the people.
What about the issue, though, Josiah, and I know you deal with this in great detail in the book, of human agency? I take your point that perhaps it was hard growing up for your family and for your friends of your family in Mason City, Iowa. It wasn't necessarily Central Park, New York. It wasn't the Upper West Side. But at the same time, don't people have agency? Can't they, or shouldn't they be able to see through some of this? I mentioned it was evangelical nonsense. Maybe that's being rather unfair, but you saw through it. And that's what the book is really about. It's about your journey from belief to skepticism. What happens to agency? Where's it gone in communities like Mason City, where so many people have become taken over perhaps by this evangelical mysticism?
Well, speaking to my experience, there was a lot of, I guess, what could be characterized as mind control in the world that I was growing up in. You're discouraged from, exploring books outside of this realm. It's very much a bubble of media and theology. And the way I understood the ticket out of hell and into heaven was belief. And there's a lot of scripture about this. If you believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, then you'll have everlasting life. And so I, spent periods in Christian schools and public schools. And when I was at a public school, there would be information that would contradict my beliefs, learning about religions of the world, learning about mythologies that were similar to Christianity, but predated it. And these were things that I needed to cover my ears, sometimes literally, and protect my belief from the danger of what I would describe now as logic. So I would silence that inner voice that said, like, yeah, but that doesn't quite make sense. What about this? And what about that? Those were very scary moments of, shutting down all intellectual inquiry. And it was only when I was in my 20s and I left that area and had experiences outside of that world that I slowly loosened those constraints on my inner monologue, which would be the agency that you speak of. And for me, losing my faith, getting out of this world, wasn't a pleasant experience. It wasn't anything I pursued. I did not rebel against this world. It was logic and education that made my faith slip through my fingers. And it was a very traumatic and uncomfortable experience.
Yeah, I'm not sure you answered my question. It wasn't really about yourself. You're clearly someone who's manifested agency. But for the others, I mean, the narrative, at least in The Music Man, is of a con man, Harold Hill, coming into town and selling people a massive lie and taking advantage of their innocence. And they were school children in a band. That's one thing. But these are grown-ups who buy the mythology of the evangelicals. What's happened to their agency? Have they been taken over? Is there some sort of Manchurian candidate narrative going on here, Josiah?
I think you can make that argument. I think you can make that argument about any kind of religious institution that people are, like myself, unwilling or uncomfortable to challenge their beliefs. And I see this in secular institutions as well. And it was the adults in The Music Man that were taken in. It was the mayor of the town. It was the school board. It was, all of these grown adults who wanted to believe in The Music Man. And it was only when an outsider, another salesman who knew that Harold Hill was a fraud, came to town and gave them evidence that he was pulling this con in all of these other towns, that the people started to get angry about what they'd been told.
Yeah, there's a very Midwestern narrative here, and the Kansas narrative of a Wizard of Oz and getting behind the curtain. I mean, this isn't a uniquely American story, but it does seem to resonate so much in the Midwest where you grew up. Is that fair, and why is it the case?
I think you can make an argument that the South is far more evangelical and the Southeast than the Midwest. I think, going back to post-Civil War America. The Midwest was kind of up for grabs. That era was very much North versus South, but the Midwest was kind of in the middle. That was the time of the Homestead Act, and a lot of people coming from Norway and Germany, like my ancestors, and setting up shop in the farms of the Midwest. And there was this period of the Sawdust Trail, where these traveling preachers were coming from town to town in the Midwest to these small communities and setting up a tent revival. And I talk about one experience or one instance in my hometown where this famous healer, Catherine Kuhlman, comes to town and builds this church and purports to heal all of these people, but her and her preaching partner end up just racking up these massive amounts of debt with this church and pocketing loads of money, and then driving off down into Georgia to pull the exact same ruse again. It's very much The Music Man. I never found any evidence that Meredith Willson was writing about traveling preachers when he wrote The Music Man, but I suspect that he was because it just really seems to fit a lot of the stories that were going on at that time that he's writing about, which is like the turn of the century Iowa.
Yeah, and as you say, it's very much of a Western thing. One of my favorite American movies about this is McCabe and Mrs. Miller, wonderfully rich.
Yeah, I mean, that's more, Western mining community. But yeah, it's one of my favorite movies as well. Great Leonard Cohen soundtrack.
Lots of sin, lots of humor. Josiah, you have, in a sense, would it be fair to say that you've found yourself through writing? You went from the pews. There are other authors like yourself who've gone from what one person described as gone from the pews to prose. How has writing helped reinvent Josiah Hesse?
I think that's absolutely the case with me. And, I was writing for about 8 years before I ever thought to do anything with it, to show anybody my writing, to try and be published and make money. I had flunked out of high school. I never went to college and was just traveling around working these very low wage jobs. And writing was an arena. Playfulness, and it's a term that troubles me because playfulness lights up the brain like no other activity, and it's something that we need to engage in more often. It's kind of seen as the enemy of ambition, because the definition would be like when the purpose of the act is less important than the act itself, so like the end result. And through writing, I could kind of loosen those constraints on my mind that I had grown up with, where there was a very rigid way to think and to behave and to do things. And suddenly I had this world that I could create literally anything. I could make anything happen in my writing. And suddenly my imagination was zipping off in so many different directions, and my curiosity was set aflame. So, within the writing, I would also be doing a great deal of reading, a great deal of research. And I wrote fiction for a good 10 years, and a lot of that fiction incorporated essays and pieces of history that were just a great deal of fun for me. But it also gave me a kind of intellectual rigor and a comfort within my own mind.
It kind of gives you the secular power of an evangelical thinker without perhaps destroying other people's lives, enriching other people's lives. You noted earlier, Josiah, that Christianity can be anything. It can be good, it can be bad. It depends what you want to take from the Gospels, from the text. You write about other evangelicals who are not quite perhaps as troubling as the worst of them. One character I'd never heard of, Lonnie Frisbee, who has perfectly named, it could have been named out of Hollywood, but a real person, an American charismatic evangelist in the 60s and 70s. Tell me about him and his hippie appearance and what he tells us perhaps about the diversity of the evangelical movement.
Yeah, so Lonnie Frisbee was part of what's known as the Jesus movement. It could be argued that he was the founder of it, which is a kind of post-hippie cultural religious movement in the 70s, primarily in California. It wound up spreading around the world and really shaped the evangelicalism we have today. That was where Christian rock came from. And it wasn't terribly popular at the time. I often compare the bands from that scene to the Velvet Underground, you know, who sold like 30,000 copies of their first album. But like that Brian Eno quote, everyone who bought one started a band. And, you know, Larry Norman and Lonnie Frisbee and a host of other characters kept the aesthetics of the hippie movement, the bare feet, the bell bottoms, the beards and long hair. But they went for what could be accurately portrayed as a very conservative Christianity, a fundamentalist, apocalyptic Christianity. They were very obsessed with the end of the world. They believed it was right around the corner. They had this book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which was the best-selling nonfiction book of the 1970s. And for a while, Bob Dylan was a part of that scene. He recorded 3 Christian rock albums. I think the only Grammy that he's won was for his first Christian rock album, Slow Train Comin'. But that scene, you know, was kind of loose and DIY and a bit anarchistic until people like Billy Graham and Campus Crusade for Christ and really the Republican Party kind of co-opted that movement in the 1980s and created the mega churches and televangelists that we know of today. But really, it came out of that scene. And, you know, Lonnie Frisbee is kind of a tragic character in a lot of ways because he was gay or maybe characterized as bisexual, very closeted. He died of AIDS, which is something that evangelicals don't really acknowledge. There was a very popular movie that came out like 2 years ago called The Jesus Revolution that starred Kelsey Grammer, and Lonnie Frisbee was a lead character in that. And they never mention his sexuality or how he died. And it was very controversial. And there were many LGBTQ characters in the Jesus movement that for a time were accepted and were a part of the scene, living who they were. But as it grew, as more people were involved and more money became involved, they got sidelined and scandalized and eventually squeezed out of their communities. There was a lot of tragedies that came out of that scene, but it started out as something very beautiful in a lot of ways. Lonnie
So do
Frisbee
you
and
write
others
about
just
it?
wanted to turn people on to Christ.
Right. Do you write about Lonnie Frisbee and that movement, that scene, with a degree of nostalgia, personally?
I do. I mean, I hope that I can still have some objective journalistic chops when I'm reporting on that. But this was the scene that my parents came out of. Like everything, every cultural movement in America, things start on the coasts, and then as years pass, they eventually make it to the Midwest. So by the late 70s and early 80s, that scene was very booming in North Iowa. And, you know, I inherited my parents' record collection. I listened to that music. There's a lot of really great music that came out of that scene. Phil Keaggy was an excellent songwriter and guitar player. He's very much like a Paul McCartney kind of character. Larry Norman has some really great songs. Children of the Day. There was a lot that came out of that scene. And I would say the same thing with the Christian music that I grew up in the 1990s. I still listen to a great deal of that today as well.
So what conclusions have you made, Josiah, from this experience and from this book On Fire for God? Are you suggesting that we need meaning? I mean, we obviously don't need the evangelical equivalent of the scamming equivalent of Harold Hill. But is your experience of guys like Lonnie Frisbee and that alternative evangelical movement, maybe let's call it left evangelism, is that perhaps something we need in an age where we seem lost for meaning, we're lonely, we're miserable?
Excuse me, just a second. swallowed wrong.
Take your time.
I don't think I would. Sorry. I don't think it would be fair to characterize Lonnie Frisbee as left wing. Sorry, just a moment.
See, whenever you talk about something serious, you almost die, Josiah.
Right?
I think the ghost of Lonnie Frisbee is somewhere in that room in Denver.
Oh, I certainly hope so. I don't know if it'd be fair to characterize him as left wing. And equally, I don't know if right wing feels appropriate either, because he was a very complicated character. Maybe Oppenheimer would be someone that would be similar, having very opposing
Robert Oppenheimer,
views.
the atom bomb guy.
Yeah.
That's an interesting comparison.
I don't know if the Jesus movement either would be considered left wing, because they were, there were mainline Protestants at that time that were part of the left, and America was fairly liberal through most of the 20th century, leading up to the Reagan era. And the Jesus movement saw the mainline Protestants as the man, as the institutions that they wanted to rebel against, and fundamentalism was punk rock to them. I mean, they wouldn't have that term at the time, but you know what I mean. I do think there are some really great examples of left-wing Christianity throughout the 20th century, particularly Martin Luther King, Jimmy Carter. You could argue that FDR embodied the social gospel of liberal Christianity. And there's certainly plenty of passages in the Bible that are very, I would say, downright socialistic. When Jesus said, sell everything you own and give it to the poor, and it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He was very much, in today's parlance, a lefty. He was a pacifist. He was a peace activist. He embodied what I would say are the better angels of humanity. And yes, I do think that's something that we could use more of today. And I don't think there's been a Christian progressive movement in America that's had any teeth really since the civil rights era.
In a way, it seems from your narrative and these kind of discussions that things haven't really changed in the last 100 years in America. 100 years ago, there was the famous Scopes trial in Tennessee about whether or not the Bible was literally true. Has much changed, Josiah, since Scopes in small towns like Mason City?
There are certainly a lot of similarities from that time. I mean, obviously things have changed in some good ways, some bad ways, but then in many ways they haven't. Evolution was such a boogeyman for fundamentalists in 1925, and yet a lot of America thought it was ridiculous that they were so up in arms about it. They were laughed at by journalists like H.L. Mencken. And up through the 20th century, fundamentalists were mocked for believing in a literal 6-day creation of the earth, for a literal virgin birth, or to view the Bible as a whole as completely infallible. But those things were institutions that I grew up with. That was my science education, learning about Noah's Ark and the Great Flood and the literal scientific meteorological explanation for that. So in that way, yes, things are very much the same as they were a century ago, and people are still susceptible to the same fears that they were at that time, whether it be new technology, liberation of some social minority group, changes in sexuality, in gender expression, and big strong con men coming to town with the answer that soothes everyone's fears, or at least makes them believe if we do what this guy says, if we put him in a position of power, then we'll be safe from these scary changes that we're not used to. And those con men using the same rhetoric of it was better when you were kids. Trump's got "Make America Great Again," which was something that a phrase that Ronald Reagan used during his first campaign. He was hearkening back to the 50s and the 60s, but then at that time, Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell were hearkening back to the 30s and the 40s. And then at that time, the Klan was hearkening back to the turn of the century. They had that song, Old Time Religion. So we see these same patterns again and again throughout history.
Couple more questions. You've been very generous with your time. You write for The Guardian. You've written extensively on the way in which the Christian rock star Michael Tate literally ruined people's lives through accusations of sexual assault. To what extent, in your view, I'm not suggesting that the Billy Grahams or the Jerry Falwells are sexual criminals, but to what extent, in your view, is your own narrative really one, and so many young men like you growing up in places like Mason City, of having your lives completely wrecked, destroyed by this dark evangelical belief?
Well, there's a few things to unpack there. I don't think that it destroyed my life. I think it made my childhood very difficult and gave me a lot of challenges as an adult that are still with me to this day. But those things can often make you stronger and give you a sense of purpose in life. And when it comes to someone like Michael Tate, I think you can point a finger at Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell, because they were the mentors of DC Talk, which was the band that made Michael Tate famous. It was Jerry Falwell's Old Time Gospel Hour that Michael Tate got to start singing on as a young man. And when DC Talk came around in the late 80s, Jerry Falwell saw them as an opportunity to be a kind of mouthpiece for the rhetoric of the Christian right when it comes to conservative economic principles or social issues like purity culture. They got people, tens of thousands of young people, to sign virginity pledges, and they filled us with a lot of rhetoric that was very harmful. I got a great deal of rapture terror from the songs of DC Talk as a young man. And they toured with Billy Graham. They were part of his crusades. So they were very much bolstered by these institutions of the Christian right. And, just clarify the harm that Michael Tate did specifically, and there's no evidence currently that the other members of the band were aware of this or were involved. But he was, I would say, credibly accused. He hasn't been criminally charged. He hasn't gone through any kind of criminal court, but accused by many young men of being groomed by them and then eventually drugged and sexual assaulted on multiple occasions in some cases, and really ruined their lives, gave them a great deal of trauma, and in some cases pulled out support for their music careers, and was a very insidious character that was a part of all of our lives. I mean, if you grew up in this world, there was no getting around DC Talk. They were often known as the Beatles of Christian rock. They were as big as it got in the 1990s.
Finally, Josiah, a couple of days ago, the Heritage Foundation, right-wing foundation in Washington, D.C., very much fused, I think, with this evangelical culture ideology, came out with some suggestions about how young people should live their lives, virginity, no online dating, and so on and so forth. Very, very conservative. I'm guessing you're not a big fan of the Heritage Foundation and that kind of way of looking at the world. What should progressives, even progressive believers, what kind of alternative do they need to offer to young people in the second quarter of the 21st century, not just in small towns like Mason City, but all over America, offering an alternative to this evangelical fervor, which is very seductive, as you've already noted, and also young people are very vulnerable to being, I use this word a little carefully, infected by it. What's the alternative?
Well, I'll stress that I'm not an educator and I don't have kids. So when it comes to child rearing, I'm far from an expert. But I think something that I could have benefited from is emphasizing curiosity among young people and openness of speech and communication and diversity of ideas, a kind of open marketplace of ideas, and you know, toning down some of the heated rhetoric around people who believe differently than you do, and still protecting say young queer youth, which I think is very important and becoming more and more dire as we go on in the Trump administration. But if progressives want to take the high road against the Christian right, they need to emphasize the need to speak to people outside of the progressive bubble, and not mirror the same kind of fundamentalism that I grew up with in the Christian right, but encourage people to read books by those that they disagree with. And I don't say that as that it's a road to agreeing with them or believing what they believe, but you strengthen your own perspective and your own ideas when you engage with people who believe things that are different than you. And when there's an openness with curiosity, compassion, playfulness, you get a greater deal of authentic intelligence, intellectual strength, and understanding that I think is often lacking in progressive circles.
Well, one book you might read to think a little more creatively and openly is Josiah Hesse's new book, On Fire for God. It's out today. Congratulations, Josiah, and thank you so much for appearing on the show. Very free-ranging conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Andrew. This has been a lot of fun.